Hello my friends, welcome to my corner. Unfortunately and unfairly, we don't often hear about literature from El Salvador, and yet there's a novel from El Salvador that has been described as one of the most important Latin American novels of the 20th century. One Day of Life by Manlio Argueta, or Un día en la vida. The title in Spanish literally is A Day in the Life, just like the Beatles song. But I really like the translation of the title as One Day of Life into English. So I saw a copy, this is how I first found out about this novel, for sale at a local library, but it was the translation into English. So I thought to myself, hey, let's hold on a little bit, let's see if I can get my hands on a copy of the original in Spanish. And I finally managed to do that. This is a very interesting novel that deals with a crucial, very difficult moment in the history of El Salvador. So let me tell you about One Day of Life by Manlio Argueta. First of all, let's begin with a little bit of history so that we can place this in context. On October 15, 1979, there was a coup d'etat in El Salvador, and this event is generally taken to be, or considered to be, the beginning of the Salvadoran Civil War, which lasted, of course, from 1979 until 1992, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So we have a very long civil war here, and let me tell you, it was brutal. Okay, the numbers, the official numbers, we are talking about 75,000 dead, 8,000 disappeared at least. So you can tell this was really a very difficult time for El Salvador as a nation. And throughout that civil war, the government of El Salvador had, of course, the support of the US government, beginning with the Carter administration, but mostly through the years of the Reagan administration. At the beginning of this civil war, you may know about this, it was that Bishop Oscar Romero was assassinated. This happened in March of 1980. You may have seen the film Romero with Raúl Juliá in the title character. It's a very powerful film, so I highly recommend it to you. We watched it in school, in high school in Argentina, so I still have the images from that film very clear in my mind. And of course, another film, if you want also some context, very important one, is Salvador by Oliver Stone. So this film is really not perfect, of course, not absolutely objective. It's Oliver Stone, so we can expect certain things, but it's still quite adequate. And I watched it as some kind of preparation for the reading of this novel so that I would have some kind of visual background to it. Manlio Argueta's novel, One Day of Life, was published in 1980. And it actually portrays those first years, maybe first months of the Salvadoran Civil War. The translation into English, by the way, which is by Bill Brow, was published in 1983 by Vintage, so only 3 years after the publication of the actual original novel, but at a time that it was highly relevant because the Salvadoran War, Civil War, was still going on, and very bloody conflict happening at the time. So as the title indicates, One Day of Life, or A Day in the Life, however you prefer, what we get here is a day in the life of a woman who all of a sudden finds herself confronted or facing the authorities. Because of this day in the life approach, there is really no plot, but what we have is a series of events, and these are punctuated by flashbacks and also by passages or sections that are narrated by other characters. So in this case, we have a story that ends but does not conclude. Okay, I always like to make that distinction right there. We get a slice of life. This is just one period, one segment of the life of this character, and that's why we have that ending but not really a conclusion. We get the sense that after we close the book, life is going to continue for some of these characters, of course. The novel, structure-wise, is divided into 21 sections or 21 chapters, and the titles of those sections or chapters are the hours of the day, beginning with 5:30 a.m. up to 5 p.m. The novel, just to give you an idea of the extent of this, as you can see, it's a pretty slim volume in Spanish. It is 166 pages in Spanish, and the English translation is a little bit longer because in the Spanish version we have quite a bit of text packed into each page. So the English version is 224 pages in length. So let's look at the characters, a little bit at the story, the events here. Our protagonist is a woman by the name of Guadalupe Fuentes de Guardado, but we know her primarily as Lupe in the nickname. So she is humble, she is stoic, she is a very strong woman, she is 44 years old, and from her perspective it is that we encounter most of the events that we read about in this novel. Not really, I would say, in the sense of narration, but more like an interior monologue. We really get inside her mind, and that of course also involves narration or narrative at some points, but I would describe it primarily as an interior monologue. She has a husband. His name is Jose, or affectionately Chepe, and her daughter Maria Pia is also mentioned quite a bit. Maria Pia has in turn a daughter named Adolfina. This is Lupe's granddaughter. She is a very, very important character in this story. And there's a son also of Lupe's called Justino, who is also mentioned and plays a very important role in the history, let's put it that way, of this family. Now the novel, when you begin reading it, 5:30 in the morning, it begins with a description of the maybe everyday activities that you can find in a rural setting, like in a farm, so it begins with something very quotidian, the day-to-day life. But then the conflict really begins when the authorities show up at some point in the day at Lupe's house, and they ask, okay, where is Adolfina Guardado, because we are looking for her, we need to talk to her. So she really sees literally how the conflict enters her home, her space, right? So that's a very important point, and that's the main conflict of this novel. Regarding style, okay, the style I would say is quite rich, because we get lots of different things here. We get interior monologue, we get narrative, we get memories, we get passages narrated by other characters, including a couple of passages narrated by the authorities. It says them, or they. And this is a collective character that represents the thoughts and the approach of the authorities. Because our protagonist is a very humble character, the style of the language itself is quite colloquial. We even have some quote-unquote foul language every now and then, because this is the normal speech of people. And you also get plenty of uniquely Salvadoran words. For example, I learned that cipote or cipota, masculine or feminine, is a kid. Okay, I learned that chucho is a dog. I did not know these words, but I did not need a dictionary or anything like that, because you can tell by the context, and there are plenty more. Now, if you read it in Spanish, you're going to notice also the use of vos instead of tú. It's what we call voseo. Okay, so the second person singular you in Spanish usually is tú, right? But in some countries they also use vos. This is the case of Argentina, and because of that, the verbs, the form of the verbs, the conjugations also change. So let me give you a couple of quick examples. For example, in Spanish you would say, the regular Spanish, right? You would say tú tienes, you have, right? Tú tienes. With voseo it becomes vos tenés. So you see the difference right there. Tú puedes, vos podés, to say you can, right? So the stem changing verbs, there's a difference right there. It's not formal, it's still informal. It's the same thing as saying tú when you use vos, but there's that little difference. Most of the time associated with Argentina, if you hear somebody speaking like that, most of the time people will assume they are either from Argentina or, of course, right next door, Uruguay. But there are also many countries in Central America that use that. El Salvador is obviously an example. I know of Nicaragua also. I know that in some places in Guatemala, even some places in Mexico, they use the voseo. So you're going to find that as very distinctive, type of speech in this novel. Now, an interesting thing here is that even though this novel deals with the Salvadoran Civil War, life in El Salvador, especially in 1980, we also get a tiny element of folklore here. And I really, really enjoy that, because there are descriptions of encounters with a couple of folkloric, mythological figures. The first one that we hear about is the cadejos, also known as cadejo. And this creature actually makes an appearance in the book by Miguel Ángel Asturias, Leyendas de Guatemala, or Guatemala Legends, Legends of Guatemala. So it's something that you can find throughout Central America. And the cadejos is a dog-shaped spirit, but you have to be careful here because there are two of them. There's a good one and an evil one. So I thought it was really interesting that we have the same name for this mythological creature, but you have one that acts in a good way and one that acts in a negative or evil way. And the other mythological folkloric figure that you hear about is the Siwanaba. Okay, this is a beautiful woman that has a very long black hair. If you look at her from behind, you just see this black hair. But then when she reveals her face, sometimes it may look like the face of a horse, or even just a skull. Okay, so really scary moment there for somebody who's following this beautiful woman, and then you realize that she's not what she seems. So I thought that was a really interesting touch, really nice, not something that I was expecting in a novel about the brutal reality, of the Salvadoran Civil War on a day-to-day basis. Themes, okay, themes. There's a kind of a braid going on here of three main elements. These would be the leitmotifs here. And of course they are violence, poverty, and illness. Okay, illness, especially when it's illness in little kids, in children. So it's particularly sad when you read about this. And because of that, because of these leitmotifs that are interwoven, you can tell that this is a tough read. Okay, this is really a tough read. But there are other two themes, two others that I wanted to kind of touch upon, at least briefly. One of them is the role of religion. So interestingly, in the case of El Salvador, the Catholic Church, generally speaking, did not side with the government. Okay, unlike other places in Latin America where you hear that maybe the church was supportive or at least complicit with the dictatorships. In this case, clearly, generally speaking, once again, because there are always exceptions. You could say, okay, in Argentina, generally speaking, people say that the church sided with the government. But then there were exceptions like the case of Padre Mujica, who was assassinated during the Dirty War. So in El Salvador, it's a little bit different. And remember that Bishop Romero was assassinated. So he was actually speaking against the government. So that's a very interesting thing here. And you can see in the characters that they try to hide their Catholicism, their Christianity, because if the authorities realize that they are practicing Catholics or Christians, they may associate that with a certain, left-wing type of ideology. The other interesting thing to me in this case, we have the role of religion, and then the US-Latin America dichotomy. Okay, and this you get in particular when you hear the authorities speaking, in those passages where you get the perspective of the authorities. And what you hear here is praise of the US, like the work ethic, the brands of Christianity that are practiced in the US, generally speaking, versus the Catholicism of Latin America. Also the socioeconomic system, okay, capitalism, consumerism, and all that. So you hear a praise of that and a denigration, maybe self-deprecation of Latin America and all that it practices, all its values and all that. And keep in mind, this is mentioned in the novel, that the authorities, when you hear this from their perspective, they are trained by a gringo and also by an Asian man. So it's a very interesting situation that we have going on right here. But those are two themes that I wanted to highlight, besides that braid that I mentioned before of violence, of poverty, and of illness. So the bottom line here, according to some information that I found on the internet, this little novel, One Day of Life, was placed number 5 in a kind of list that the Modern Library put together of the 100 best Latin American novels. Is that a fair assessment? You decide. Okay, but what I am going to say is that this is a really powerful novel that shows you the horrors of the Salvadoran Civil War in vivid and very realistic detail. Okay, so it is really a heartbreaking read, but at the same time, it is in a way a hopeful read, because it shows you as a kind of testament, a kind of testimony, the strength of the people, their drive to go on no matter what, their struggle. So I think you have, of course, a negative side, but you also have a positive side when you look at the stoicism, and the strength of these characters. So I highly recommend this novel to you, especially if you want to read something from El Salvador, because I think it's, a country that does not get enough recognition when it comes to the great literature that it has produced. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? You know that I'm always listening and I always love to hear your thoughts. Those were my 2 cents on One Day of Life by Manlio Argueta. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for stopping by and have a wonderful day.